Welcome to UnHerd and to LockdownTV. We are on day one of government lockdown, and while we're all stuck at home staring at our screens, we thought we would experiment with a new video podcast in which we talk to our contributors and our editors about the kind of thinking they are doing during this weird time. The technology is a bit new, the internet connections are dubious, so we don't know how it's going to play out, but bear with us. I'm Freddie Sayers, Executive Editor here at UnHerd, and joining us today we have Timandra Harkness, author, broadcaster, and expert on all things big data and technology. We have Tom Chivers, our very own science correspondent and author of many books. We'll be talking to both of them about how people assess risks and rewards and how they treat information. And then later on, we will be joined by two eminent historians, Tom Holland, author of recent bestseller Dominion, about the influence of Christianity on Western culture, and our very own Ed West, author of multiple history books, most recently the newly published Small Men on the Wrong Side of History, about the demise of conservative thinking. So let's start first by going to Timandra and Tom, who you can see hopefully next to me. How is your lockdown going, guys?
Well, I was slightly ahead of the curve, I think, because I think I'm just going through a very, very mild form of the virus. So I actually locked myself down from Friday so as not to pass it on to anybody. I think you're okay, Tom. I don't think you can get it through the internet. If you can, then we're all buggered. Can I say buggered? I just did. So I feel a bit ahead of it, but also it's a bit odd because I quite often work from home anyway. So for me, it's not much of a change so far. I think it's more than it will be when I'm allowed out again. When I find the streets deserted and just being patrolled by armed police saying, "Have you already bought enough beans? Go home, citizen, go home."
So it sounds like we might be bringing a world first of talking to a live COVID-19 sufferer.
I doubt it's a first, and I'm certainly, if this is it, I've been very lucky and got away with a very mild dose.
So let's start.
I've diagnosed myself about 6 times already. Sorry, Freddie, carry on.
Let's go straight in with Timandra then. I mean, Timandra, you wrote a great piece for us this morning, basically looking at a particular book and arguing that the myth that humanity is ultra gullible and people are kind of dim is actually not true.
Yeah, so this is the book. It's very good. Yes, I think it's very interesting. I'd come across the author before, Hugo Mercier, when I made the radio series about how to disagree. I spoke to him and his co-author Dan Sperber of a previous book, which argued that human reasoning has evolved in the social setting. I mean, perhaps ironically for now, when we're all isolated and locked down, that reasoning is something that people do together. And so arguing and being better at picking holes in somebody else's argument than your own actually works really well in real human context. And this book came out of a really, I asked him how he came to write it, and he said that he and Dan Sperber and some other people wrote an article about 10 years ago saying that humans actually are quite motivated to analyze information that's coming to them and go, who's telling me this? Why are they telling me? What do they want me to think? What's in it for them? Should I believe them? So and in general, quite skeptical. And ever since then, people have contacted him going, oh, yes, but what about this? What about this case? What about Hitler? What about flat earthers? And every time he said, he went away and went, oh, well, no, actually, maybe you've got a point. Maybe I'm wrong. I'll go and look into this. And every time he found research already there that showed that people actually were not as gullible as we tend to assume. So in the end, he said he had enough for a book. So he put it all in a book.
So applying that thought then, do you think all these people walking around obediently in their singles or pairs are in some way assessing evidence, or do you think people have signed up to the science of this current outbreak through that kind of quite a kind of canny assessment, or do you think people are just kind of doing what they're told?
Well, yeah, but I think doing what you're told is a kind of assessment. When you do what you're told, you have assessed that the people telling you probably know best in this case, or possibly that even if you don't think they know best, it's in your own interests or in the interests of other people who are worried that you do what you're told. I mean, this is his kind of argument, that even people can still do what are apparently quite irrational things and be bad at weighing up particular evidence, but that in the human context, maybe their decision isn't irrational because they have decided who to trust, or they've decided that doesn't actually make that much difference to them.
Okay, so if we can go to Tom. You also wrote a great piece for us this morning, which looked at sort of game theory and gave some quite clear kind of case studies of how game theory might apply to the current coronavirus situation. Do you think people are essentially going through some kind of game theory calculations in miniature when they make decisions about risks they take today?
Well, I think that game theory is meant to describe the way that people think and the way that people rationalize stuff. So it's not that people are doing sort of subconsciously running sort of microscopic prisoner's dilemma games in their brain. It's that this is meant to be a sort of shortcut way of describing how thought processes work and how you make decisions when you don't know what someone else's decision will be and that sort of thing. So I mean, for instance, if you know that if you know there's enough Calpol to go around, but you're not sure that everyone else isn't going to stockpile it, then it's rational for you to go and buy more Calpol than you would need before your next shop, because you're not sure if everyone else will clear the shelves. And so you end up in this sort of, even though it is bad for everyone if you do that, because you'll end up spending more money than you need, but everyone else will not have any, it is perfectly rational for you to stockpile and clear the shelves of Calpol. So these sort of decision-making processes that are rational and end up with bad outcomes for everyone are a sort of thing that game theory talks about, and they're exactly why you need central coordination, in this case government, to come in and say this is how we need everyone to behave. So and that's what the lockdown is getting everyone to stop doing the simple the personally rational but societally bad ideas of like it's all right for me to go out and mingle in a park because my personal risk is low, but if everyone does that, then the overall risk goes up enormously.
When we carry on with that kind of assessment anyway, though, I mean, you know, what we're essentially being asked now to say that staying at home and like massively curtailing normal life is to be weighed against a risk of, you know, a large number of deaths and hospitals being overwhelmed. So in a sense, the argument is still, you know, it's a kind of utilitarian argument we're getting, which is, you know, take this bad in order to ensure that this worst thing doesn't happen.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that it's really really sort of starkly utilitarian at the moment. You know, everyone argues all the time about or everyone, I think, has their different opinions about whether utilitarianism is a correct moral philosophy. Maybe they don't even think that far into it in most cases, but I sort of get the impression that, like, you know, they say there's no atheists in a foxhole. There's no it's everyone's a utilitarian in a pandemic, right? You have to do these trade-offs. You know, if doctors have to do it. You know, if I treat this person, that means letting this person die. The government has to do it. If we apply our resources to the pandemic, it means that the economy will crash in these different ways. And individuals have to do it in this really stark way, right? That, you know, if I go to the park, there is a 99% chance that my children will have a nice time, but there is a 0.05% chance that I will kill an old person. And you have to trade these things off. You have to say, like, they take these really sacred values, like how important is it to me that I don't raise the risk of someone dying? How much do I have to compare that to the nice time that my children will have? And you realize it's not you don't apply an infinite value to the likelihood that someone will die. You have to do these awful trade-offs of high impact versus low risk and high likelihood versus low impact, and it's really difficult. And I don't think people are literally doing these calculations in their heads, but it is what some part of their brain is having to do.
Have you noticed that already? You know, we're in day one of the actual mandate shutdown, and already you're seeing articles and people are messaging about, you know, whether this strategy is viable long term, and the same kind of calculus comes in. You know, there are people saying, you know, what are the potential numbers of deaths caused by the economic global shutdown. I read a piece recently about that, speculating that maybe people would be less healthy, there'd be potholes in the roads, we're actually, more people may die in this kind of starkly utilitarian logic.
Yeah.
Do you guys, and this is for Timandra also, do you think that as we go on, it's still kind of a novelty now and it's just started, as we go on, those kind of pressures and those kind of calculations are going to become starker?
Yeah, but yes, I do. And I think it's right that they should be discussed, because I think in a way what we have at the moment is not utilitarian. It's absolutely not utilitarian, because I think an absolutely utilitarian calculation would be weighing up what we do and don't know about the way coronavirus behaves, about how different human behaviors affect the rate of transmission, but weighing that up against other costs. And by costs, I mean human costs. I'm not even interested in the monetary value, but I think it's pretty clear that an extended lockdown is what it would take to get rid of the coronavirus until we get a vaccine or something, if we wanted to have this absolute minimal transmission model. And the impact of that just on human beings having to be separated from each other and having to stay indoors a lot and not just simply not exercise, not have human contact, not have daylight and fresh air. Can you imagine if a year ago somebody had said, right, for this government policy reason, we need everybody to stay indoors most of the time, leave the house once a day, not meet anyone outside their immediate family for months on end. The public health people would have said, are you crazy? Can you imagine what that will do to people's sanity and to people's physical health to not be moving around, and to their vitamin D levels? We'll have rickets everywhere. So these things have a real human cost, and we've not had time to sit down and actually say, right, so what are going to be the most effective things to minimize the spread of coronavirus, at least until the health service is up to speed with the massively increased demand? And what are the costs of that going to be in human terms, even leaving aside long-term effects of the recession? And therefore, what are the choices and what we're prepared to do? But I think it was just impossible to say, let's have a really utilitarian calculation and say, sorry, frail grandma and diabetic uncle, you're going to have to die in the short term, because in the long term we would lose X number of human lives and years because of locking everybody down. I think that was just impossible. And I think that's right, actually. I don't want to live in a strictly utilitarian society, but I also think that those future human lives are equally real human lives. They're just much harder to calculate. So at some point we are going to have to say, we can't carry on with this indefinitely. What's the best way out of it?
It's been interesting, the kind of politics of it. People keep saying we defer to the science, but of course, in reality, there's a lot of politics going on as well, and I guess rightly so, because ultimately it's a political decision, how we organize our society and what steps we collectively take. But I wonder whether, as time goes on and those kind of feelings increase, people will start finding different arguments that they find more attractive. And at the moment there's this kind of like almost sort of blanket ban on questioning the government strategy, and I think looking at the YouGov polling that's just come out today, they're all enjoying absolute bumper approval ratings. There's only one direction that can go, really, don't you think?
Wait. Which bit of the internet are you on that you see a blanket ban of questioning the government policy? We must be in very, very different bits of the internet, because all I can see
I see people
constantly saying that they've not gone far enough. My bits of, I suppose, the bits of the internet that I hang around in, which are sort of nerdy, but they're heavily overrepresented sort of nerds and libertarians and all the sort of weird sort of strange bits of the internet. They have been panicking about this for months, and they think the government has not been going anywhere near far enough, and they should have had this lockdown 3 weeks ago. I don't know if it would have been possible to do that right, but I certainly don't think there's been a lack of criticism from the sort of Twittery commentariat area as well. There's lots of people saying either it's gone too far, not gone far enough. But you're right. I think the public is broadly on board, because I think without wanting to say that the public has got the sort of repository of holy wisdom or anything, I think they work out this is quite a serious situation and it's okay to lock things down for this, whereas they would be very much, if you want to take away our personal liberties in other situations, they would be much more sort of, this is a bizarre and strange thing you're doing and I still want to go for a run. So no, I don't agree that there's a moratorium on criticism of the government. I just think, at the moment at least, it seems like the obvious thing to do. And you know, in times of crisis and times of stress, you do sort of tend to hope that trust the authority figure more. I mean, God knows, I don't know if anyone else has found this, but I find myself watching, thinking, oh, Boris Johnson seems to be doing an all right job. I've never thought that before in my life. So like I've sort of without, and I think that's some stress response on my part, going like, yeah, well, I'm sure I shall trust the masters, but I see a lot of people being very critical. Okay, thank you both so much. I should mention we've just heard that sadly 87 more people have died in the past 24 hours, bringing the total to 442. So those are going to be present, very real stories going ahead, and no doubt will influence the way people think about it. But thank you both very much. Thank you. We are now going on to Ed West and Tom Holland. Are you both there? Hi, Freddie. I'm just waiting here. Oh, there you are. We have appropriate, wonderful libraries of books behind each of you. And some shields.
I'm afraid I might have children coming behind me at one point. I'm going to be like that guy who does the career.
That's good. That's
because I've just, one of my children is just running by. There he goes.
There we go. How's your lockdown so far?
Tom, do you want to go first?
I have to say, I'm actually really enjoying it. I've got so much work to do, and I look at my diary and I see all the things that have been cancelled, and I, to be honest, feel a slight sense of relief. And it hasn't really changed my life to a great amount because I'm just stuck at home working. However, that said, my wife is a midwife, and she's at King's, which is basically a kind of bubbling petri dish for COVID. So I'm not wildly optimistic that I'll be healthy for long, but for now I'm enjoying it.
You gave Tom a lovely sermon earlier, I think it was earlier this week, at Great St Bartholomew's Church in London, which I listened to. You were talking about St Cuthbert and the sacrifices he kind of was prepared to endure. I think we might even have a clip of it, which would be kind of showing off our technology skills. Let's have a listen.
Cuthbert seemed the embodiment of an absolute faith, the kind of faith that could move mountains. And this faith was expressed through his willingness to put himself through austerities that perhaps even a marine today would blanch at. He thought nothing of standing up to his neck in the icy waters of the North Sea all night. He thought nothing of retreating for months at a time to an island, again out in the icy waters of the North Sea, subsisting for days at a time simply on a raw onion. And the consequence of that was that he was felt to have a supernatural quality of.
Tom Holland giving a online sermon earlier this week at Great St Bartholomew's. Tom, when you think about those kind of historical parallels, people surviving moments of adversity or plagues, do you take comfort from that?
Well, it's odd. The St Cuthbert thing began as a joke. I've got a friend, Jonathan Wilson, very distinguished football writer who's from the Northeast, and we began talking about how St Cuthbert's Day should be celebrated much more than it is, and how it was a kind of southern conspiracy against the Northeast that had been completely forgotten. So we, myself and various other people, committed ourselves to celebrating St Cuthbert's Night. We've been doing it for kind of about five years now, but it's gradually snowballed. And this year I got an invitation actually to give a sermon about St Cuthbert. So there was an entire church service going to be put on at St Bartholomew's, which is the oldest church in London. So I was really looking forward to doing that. I've never delivered a sermon. I never imagined that I would. So I was very disappointed when it, obviously the service had to be cancelled.
So is this where
I thought actually,
Tom, are we seeing the pulpit that you delivered the sermon from?
Well, yeah, I could do it seriously, because actually the very fact that we couldn't go to the church, the fact that we were in a time of plague, kind of sharpened everything that St Cuthbert historically had been about. St Cuthbert lived in an age that was, by our standards, not health and safety friendly at all. And yet he had this, the quality of his charisma enabled people to feel that there was hope, that there was purpose against the backdrop of sufferings far greater than anything that we are going through. And I did find that moving. I did find that a kind of source of inspiration, yeah.
You also wrote a lovely piece for us this morning, which made reference to T.S. Eliot and four quartets, and in particular Little Gidding, which it really is a kind of a mystical sort of poem, isn't it? In a continuum of time, and it's big ideas there. Do you feel that sort of sense of connection is something that we should be looking to in these dark days?
Well, I think the thing about Little Gidding is that maybe it takes reading it against the backdrop of crisis to realise just how profoundly the stamp of the Blitz, that's the backdrop against which Eliot was writing it. Eliot was serving as a warden on the roofs right the way through the Blitz. The bombers are a constant presence throughout that poem. But normally when you read it, you don't actually dwell on that. But now it's really foregrounded. And Little Gidding itself serves as a reminder of a previous period of crisis, the Civil War. It's a kind of chapel that Charles I visited 3 times, and Eliot alludes to Charles I in the poem. He also alludes to Milton. He alludes to the two sides of the Civil War being blended together by the sense of distance. And I think that, again, as with looking at the life of Cuthbert, looking at Little Gidding and looking at Eliot's meditations on civilization in a time of crisis, gets sharpened by ourselves living through a time of crisis. Absolutely.
Ed.
Hello.
Hi. Do you get comfort from thinking about moments in history that are similar in some way?
I mean, one of the things I always liked about history is that it does remind us how lucky we are, and how bad things are. We could be in early medieval Northumbria, which certainly wasn't as fun as now in our quarantine. But also, I suppose, especially in the West, especially in England in particular, we felt like we have sort of left those crisis moments of history behind us. Certainly I felt I had, and only the last few weeks as this kind of mounting disaster kind of approaches us like an avalanche. And I suddenly feel, wow, this is actually the first real disaster I've been a part of in my lifetime, a historical moment. I'm trying to get my kids to write their coronavirus diaries so that they can, recount them in years to come, because it is I hope, not the start of a series of disasters, but the one big disaster we've lived through. I mean, even 9/11 was nothing as
do you think there's something about the fact that it's also a disease that is very much basic?
So what's that, Freddie? I missed that bit.
Do you think there's something about the fact that the threat comes in the form of like a disease, which is very bodily, and it's kind of like it could have happened at any point in history? It's almost like it sort of reveals the lie of all of the kind of technology and sophistication.
It's biting back, isn't it? I mean, because pathogens are one of the things we really left behind. Smallpox was finally eradicated only, I think, the year I was born, but it was responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths. And the most famous, of course, the Black Death, which is some comfort when I think about the coronavirus, and I worry about getting it myself. And because I'm hypochondriac and neurotic, I've already, like Tom Chivers, I've already diagnosed myself several times. But I think, well, my chance of dying are probably 1 in 3 or 400, while if I had the plague, it would be 2 in 3 or whatever, something similar. So The only thing we have comparable is the Spanish flu, and that's always sort of been overlooked because of the First World War. So we don't. The age of great epidemics seems so totally.
I wonder whether the real comparison, in a way, is less with previous plagues, because what's different now is that we have information, which they didn't have, and we don't yet have, evidence. We're not seeing, as they did, bodies on the street, and we don't see people dying. We haven't got that fear, that sort of visceral fear of that it might physically take up with us. It's the information came first. It almost feels like waiting for a war to start.
Right. There's a huge difference between people who are, I think, naturally neurotic, who are starting to worry about this, and I'm quite neurotic from quite an early point, even while it was still in the Far East, and a large part of the population who almost don't see it as anything, or just see it as another bout of the flu, or are still acting quite normally until the lockdown. So I suppose because there is so much information, but people can choose what information they go and pick at, whatever sort of suits their personality type. So it's not seen in the same way by everyone in the population, in I suppose the way other plagues might have been.
Tom, if I can just bring you in again, St. Cuthbert we've spoken about. Which are the moments in history that you kind of call to mind this weird moment we're living in?
Well, I basically have two responses when I look to the past, and one is what I wrote about in the article today, the kind of chain of the links in the chain that join us back through previous experiences of plague and disaster, back through Eliot, back through Bede, back through Gregory the Great, who in turn wrote about the book of Job, which is perhaps the earliest and profoundest meditation on why awful things happen to innocent people. So there's that. But then there is also a much more recent tradition. And I think that this gives our current experience a kind of weird slant, which is that of post-war science fiction, and specifically post-war British science fiction, because of course that's specific to this country. So I think it's difficult for anyone who has read John Wyndham not to feel that we've been blasted back to a version of the 50s in which disaster has hit. Likewise, I think anyone who has read Ballard would find it hard not to feel that there are echoes of a kind of 60s or 70s or 80s dystopia. This feels a very Ballardian crisis. And likewise, anyone who's seen Danny Boyle's zombie film 28 Days After, is it after or later? I can't remember. Again, the kind of shadow of that, of a denuded London, of a Whitehall in which a toppled double-decker bus is lying, that is also part of it. So the strangeness about this is that there's a kind of weirdly meta quality to our anxieties about apocalypse. There are absolutely the kind of the biblical ones that take us back many, many centuries, but there are much more recent ones which are probably more vivid in most people's minds. And
that sense that sort of this is just like a movie.
Absolutely, and I think on the one hand, this is, as people have said, the likelihood of us dying from this is low. Huge numbers of people are not actually dying relative to the size of the population. But the fact that we've all had to have a lockdown, the fact that the streets are empty, the fact that the great avenues of European capitals and indeed global capitals are empty, cannot help but conjure up for people images from science fiction films and from computer games in which these kind of dystopian images are absolutely part of the currency.
Definitely, yes. We find ourselves looking for memories near and far, and it all feels distinctly like normal life has been set on hold and we're in some kind of either ancient history or future dystopia. Very weird times. Thank you both very much for talking to us about it. And thanks also to Tom, Chivers and Timandra. This was the first ever Lockdown TV. I hope it's not the last. Thanks all for joining.